In the deep pine barrens of Jasper County, where the bog water runs red with iron and the canopy blocks out heaven itself, silence carries further than screams. The mist clings to the cypress knees like funeral shrouds, and the Spanish moss hangs like the hair of the drowned. It was here, in 1888, that Ephraim Cooperton built his sawmill compound, choosing isolation so complete that neighbors measured distance not in miles, but in the number of days it took to hear another human voice. For 24 years, the Cooperton family lived as ghosts among the living. Children born in that compound never learned the sound of church bells or schoolyard laughter. Instead, they learned the rhythm of the mill blade and the metallic taste of bog water, growing pale and thin under the endless twilight of the pines. The townspeople of Grist Mill Bend whispered of a blood curse, of generations poisoned by their own intermarriage, of children who died before they could speak their own names. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and how you came across this video. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. But in 1912, when County Clerk Elias Finch arrived to audit the death records, he discovered something that made the blood curse seem merciful by comparison. The ledger of a midwife hidden behind a loose brick revealed births that never appeared in the official records. Stillborn children who had been born healthy, living children who had been declared dead. What he uncovered was not a family destroyed by a curse, but a family that had learned to feed on itself, generation after generation, in the suffocating silence of the deep woods. This was not disease. This was an appetite that had consumed a bloodline for decades. To understand the Coopertons, you must first understand the land that shaped them. Jasper County sits in the heart of what locals call the Pine Barrens, a sprawling wilderness of longleaf pine and bald cypress that stretches for hundreds of square miles without a single proper road. The terrain shifts between dry, sandy ridges covered in wire grass and sudden, treacherous wetlands, where a man can sink to his waist in black muck before he realizes he has stepped off solid ground. The bog water here runs the color of strong tea, stained by decades of fallen leaves and tannic acid. It carries the metallic taste of iron ore and something else, something organic and unsettling that coats the back of your throat. The Spanish moss hangs so thick from the cypress branches that it blocks out the sun even at midday, creating a perpetual twilight that plays tricks on the mind. Sound behaves strangely in these woods. A whisper can carry for miles, while a scream seems to die just yards from where it was born. In 1885, the Jasper County Lumber Company established Grist Mill Bend as a company town on the eastern edge of this wilderness. The settlement consisted of little more than a massive sawmill, a company store, worker barracks, and a handful of houses for the foremen and their families. The mill ran day and night, its steam whistle marking the hours like a mechanical church bell, the only reliable sound in a landscape defined by silence. Sheriff Josiah Holt ran the town with an iron fist wrapped in company policy. The lumber company owned everything, from the houses to the store to the wooden sidewalks, and Holt made sure everyone understood that prosperity depended on keeping the peace and keeping outsiders at bay. Questions were discouraged, gossip was controlled, and families who caused trouble had a way of finding their logging contracts mysteriously canceled. 3 miles deeper into the Pine Barrens, where even the company surveyors feared to venture alone, Ephraim Cooperton had built his own private sawmill in 1888. He had purchased the land cheap from the county, a tract so remote and difficult to access that previous buyers had abandoned their claims after a single winter. The deed listed it as 2,000 acres of pine forest and wetland, but the boundaries were vague, marked only by blazes cut into trees that might not survive the next storm. Cooperton's mill was smaller than the company operation, designed to process timber from his own land rather than compete with grist mill Bend. He built his compound around a natural clearing where an old fire had burned away the undergrowth, leaving behind rich soil and a small spring that provided clean water year-round. The main house was constructed of heartwood pine, built to last generations, with thick walls that kept out the damp and windows placed high to discourage curious eyes. Behind the main house, Cooperton built a collection of outbuildings that spoke to a family planning to live completely off the land: a smokehouse, a root cellar, a workshop, sleeping quarters for the children and grandchildren who would work the mill and tend the property. And at the center of it all, the mill itself, a testament to Ephraim's skill as a craftsman and his determination to remain independent from the company town. The compound was accessible only by a single narrow road that wound through 3 miles of swamp and pine forest. In the rainy season, the road became impassable for weeks at a time, cutting the Coopertons off from the outside world as surely as if they lived on an island. But this isolation was not an accident. It was a choice, carefully planned and deliberately maintained. The people of Grist Mill Bend learned to think of the Coopertons as a strange but harmless family, eccentric in the way that isolated people often become. They appeared in town perhaps once a month, arriving in a wagon loaded with lumber to trade at the company store for supplies they could not produce themselves. They paid in cash, spoke little, and left as soon as their business was finished. What the townspeople noticed most about the Coopertons was their unnatural pallor and the way they seemed to move through the world like shadows. Even the children appeared ghostly, with skin so pale it seemed translucent and eyes that never quite met yours directly. The adults were thin to the point of gauntness, and they spoke in whispers even when conducting business in broad daylight. The explanation offered by the town doctor was simple and seemingly scientific. The family suffered from a hereditary condition, a form of anemia that ran in bloodlines weakened by intermarriage and isolation. It explained their pallor, their weakness, their tendency to lose children in infancy. It was a tragedy, the doctor said, but not uncommon among families who had lived too long in isolation. What no one in Gristmill Bend understood was that the pine barrens had not simply hidden the Cooperton family from the outside world. The wilderness had become their accomplice, swallowing their secrets as completely as it swallowed the screams of animals caught in its wetlands. The silence that surrounded their compound was not just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something far more deliberate. Ephraim Cooperton was a man built from the same heartwood pine as his compound, tall and weathered, with hands scarred by decades of mill work and eyes the color of bog water. Born in 1847 to a family of craftsmen, he had learned the lumber trade from his father and grandfather, men who understood that wood had grain and character that must be respected rather than forced. But where his ancestors had worked for others, Ephraim dreamed of independence, of a legacy that would belong to his bloodline alone. When he arrived in Jasper County in 1887, Ephraim brought with him his wife, Martha, a pale, silent woman who seemed to disappear into shadows even in broad daylight, and their 3 children. The eldest, Isaiah, was a boy of 12 who had inherited his father's skill, with tools but none of his ambition. The twin girls, Mercy and Ruth, were 10 years old and identical in their ghostly pallor and unnaturally quiet demeanor. Within 5 years of establishing the mill, the Cooperton family had grown to include Isaiah's wife, a distant cousin named Patience who had been brought from the old homestead in Virginia. Then came the children. First, Isaiah and Patience had twin boys, Caleb and Abel. Then Mercy married her own cousin, producing a daughter they named Sarah. Ruth took her brother's oldest boy as husband when she turned 16, bearing him 2 sons in quick succession. By 1900, The compound housed 12 adults and an ever-changing number of children whose births and deaths seemed to follow no pattern the outside world could understand. The family structure had become a tangled web of intermarriage that defied easy explanation, with brothers taking sisters, cousins marrying cousins, and generations blurring into a single pale bloodline that seemed to grow more spectral with each passing year. What struck visitors most about the Coopertons was their unnatural thinness. Even the youngest children appeared gaunt, their cheeks hollow and their eyes too large for their faces. Their skin had a translucent quality that seemed to glow with an inner light, and their hair hung lank and colorless around their shoulders. They moved with an economy of motion that suggested they were conserving energy for some greater purpose, and they spoke in whispers that carried an unsettling intensity. The family dressed uniformly in clothing that seemed to have been cut from the same bolts of dark cloth, practical garments designed for work rather than comfort or appearance. The women wore their hair pinned back severely, exposing the sharp angles of their faces and the prominence of their collarbones. The men kept their beards trimmed close, revealing jawlines that jutted like the prow of a ship cutting through water. When the Coopertons appeared in Gristmill Bend, they moved as a unit, arriving in a wagon pulled by 2 horses that looked as thin and spectral as their owners. They conducted their business with the methodical precision of people who had rehearsed every interaction, speaking only when necessary and never lingering for conversation. They purchased supplies in bulk, salt and spices and lard, but rarely any fresh meat or dairy products that would suggest a normal family diet. The townspeople noticed that the Coopertons seemed to divide into 2 distinct groups. The adults who conducted business were gaunt but functional, capable of heavy labor and complex negotiations. But there were others, younger members of the family who appeared occasionally in the wagon, who seemed even more wraith-like and insubstantial. These were the ones the locals came to call the thin cousins, individuals whose relationship to the main family remained unclear, but whose presence cast an even deeper shadow over an already mysterious clan. Maud Gable, the town's midwife and unofficial keeper of family histories, had been called to the Cooperton compound 7 times between 1890 and 1900. Each time she made the difficult journey through the pine barrens to attend a birth, and each time she returned with stories that grew more disturbing in the retelling. The women of the family, she reported, gave birth with an unnatural silence, as if they had trained themselves to endure pain without crying out. The infants were often sickly, born with an unnatural pallor that suggested they had not received enough nourishment in the womb. But what troubled Maud most was the family's response to infant mortality. When a child died, which happened with distressing frequency, the Coopertons showed no grief that she could recognize. Instead, they treated death as a practical matter, something to be dealt with efficiently and without sentiment. The bodies were wrapped quickly and buried in a family cemetery behind the compound, marked only with rough wooden crosses that bore no names or dates. Dr. Alistair Crow, the county coroner, had been called to examine 3 Cooperton deaths. During his tenure, all children under the age of 5. His official reports cited congenital anemia as the cause of death, a diagnosis that seemed to satisfy both the family and the county authorities. But privately, Crow had begun to harbor suspicions that the condition affecting the Coopertons was not entirely natural. The symptoms he observed did not match any medical literature he could find, and the family's insistence on handling their own dead without outside interference struck him as unusual. Reverend Amos Pike, who preached fire and brimstone sermons at the Methodist Church in Gristmill Bend, had attempted to minister to the Cooperton family on several occasions. His visits to the compound had been met with polite but firm resistance, as Ephraim explained that his family had their own relationship with the divine that did not require outside guidance. Pike's subsequent sermons began to include increasingly pointed references to families who lived apart from Christian community, warning his congregation about the spiritual dangers of isolation and the corruption that could take root in bloodlines that had turned away from God's light. The children of Grist Mill Bend were forbidden by their parents from venturing too far into the pine barrens, particularly in the direction of the Cooperton compound. Stories circulated among the young people about strange lights seen flickering through the trees at night, about the sound of machinery running when there should have been no work being done, and about smells that drifted on the wind that no one could quite identify, but that left listeners with an inexplicable sense of nausea. Sheriff Josiah Holt maintained that the Coopertons were law-abiding citizens whose private affairs were none of the county's business as long as they caused no trouble for their neighbors. When pressed by concerned citizens about the family's unusual practices, Holt would remind questioners that the Coopertons paid their taxes, conducted legitimate business, and had never been accused of any crime. Their eccentricities, he argued, were the natural result of isolation and should be treated with Christian tolerance rather than suspicious gossip. But even Holt had to admit that something about the Cooperton family troubled him in ways he could not articulate. During his monthly patrols through the county, he made a point of riding past the entrance to their property, telling himself he was simply maintaining a visible law enforcement presence. What he observed during these visits was a compound that seemed too quiet for a family of 12 or more people, too orderly for a working mill, and too isolated for people who claimed to be engaged in legitimate timber operations. The truth was that by 1900, the Cooperton compound had become something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human society. It was a place where family bonds had been twisted into something unrecognizable, where the cycle of birth and death had been perverted into a system that served purposes the outside world could not imagine. The thinness that marked every member of the family was not the result of poverty or disease. It was the physical manifestation of an appetite that had learned to feed on what should have been most sacred. What no one in Grist Mill Bend understood was that the Coopertons had not simply been isolated by geography and circumstance. They had been transformed by their isolation into something that was no longer entirely human, a family that had learned to survive by consuming the very future it claimed to be preserving. The pale, ghostly figures who appeared occasionally in town were not the victims of some hereditary curse. They were the products of a system so methodical and so monstrous that it had turned the bonds of blood into chains that could never be broken. The first crack in the wall of silence surrounding the Cooperton family came from a traveling salesman who lost his way in the Pine Barrens on an autumn evening in 1905. Samuel Morrison specialized in mill equipment, making his rounds through the lumber towns with a wagon full of saw blades and replacement parts. Morrison had heard rumors of a private mill operation deep in the Jasper County wilderness. The prospect of a new customer had drawn him off the main roads and into the maze of logging trails. By the time he admitted he was thoroughly lost, the shadows had merged into uniform darkness that swallowed his lantern light just yards from his wagon. It was the smell that guided him toward the Cooperton compound, wood smoke mixed with something organic and cloying that caught in his throat. Following the scent through the darkness, Morrison eventually saw the warm glow of windows flickering between the trees. Ephraim Cooperton answered Morrison's knock with politeness that seemed genuine but guarded. The tall, gaunt man listened to the salesman's explanation with patient attention. Yes, this was indeed a mill operation. No, he was not in need of equipment, but Morrison was welcome to water his horses before attempting to find his way back to the main road. Morrison accepted gratefully and Cooperton directed him to a well behind the main house. It was while unharnessing his horses that the salesman witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, transforming his simple story into a tale of horror he would repeat in letters to his brother. Near the edge of the clearing stood a windowless structure apart from the other outbuildings. Through the darkness, Morrison could make out three silhouettes moving with purposeful efficiency. The adults were Ephraim Cooperton and one of his sons, both carrying shovels. The child, wrapped in what looked like a burial shroud, was completely motionless in the younger man's arms. What Morrison witnessed next was a burial, but not the kind any Christian community would recognize. The two men had dug a shallow grave behind the windowless building, working in complete silence with practiced movements. The wrapped bundle was lowered into the earth with no ceremony, no prayers, and no visible signs of grief. But it was the conversation Morrison overheard that transformed his unease into stark terror. As the men began shoveling earth back into the grave, the younger man spoke in a whisper that carried through the still night air. The child had been stillborn, the son explained to his father, another victim of the curse that claimed so many Cooperton infants. But this one had been different. This one had been whole and healthy until the very moment of birth, when something had gone wrong. The midwife had done what she could, but it had not been enough. Ephraim's response was delivered in the same emotionless whisper, but Morrison caught enough words to understand that the older man was not discussing the tragedy of infant mortality. Instead, he seemed to be conducting some practical assessment, talking about timing and preparation and the need to maintain the balance that kept the family strong. The tone was unmistakable, the cold calculation of a man discussing inventory rather than the loss of a grandchild. Morrison remained hidden until the two men finished their work and returned to the main house. Only then did he dare approach the fresh grave, where he found a mound of earth marked by a crude wooden cross, bearing no name or date. But what disturbed him most was the realization that it was not alone. The ground around the windowless building was dotted with similar mounds. 7 years after Samuel Morrison's disturbing encounter, the man who would ultimately unravel the Cooperton mystery arrived in Gristmill Bend on a cold November morning in 1912. Elias Finch was 29 years old, ambitious, and possessed of the kind of methodical mind that found patterns where others saw only chaos. As the newly appointed county clerk for vital records, his job was to reconcile birth and death certificates across rural districts. Finch had been chosen for this position precisely because he was an outsider, a man from the county seat, with no family connections that might compromise his objectivity. The previous clerk had been a local man whose records had grown increasingly unreliable, filled with gaps and inconsistencies that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate concealment. What Finch discovered when he began reviewing the Jasper County files was a statistical anomaly so striking that he initially assumed it was clerical error. The Cooperton family, according to official death certificates, had experienced an infant mortality rate that defied both medical probability and mathematical logic. Between 1890 and 1912, 24 children bearing the Cooperton name had died before their 5th birthday, every single one from the same cause, congenital anemia. To a trained statistician, these numbers told a story that made no sense. Hereditary anemia, while more common in isolated populations with a history of intermarriage, typically claimed victims across different age groups with varying degrees of severity. But the Cooperton deaths followed a pattern so uniform it seemed almost designed, as if someone had been copying the same diagnosis over and over without regard for medical accuracy. More troubling were the gaps in the birth records. Cross-referencing the death certificates with baptismal records from the local Methodist church, Finch discovered that several children who had supposedly died of anemia had never been recorded as born in the first place. Either the family was systematically failing to register births, or children were dying so quickly after birth that they never made it into the official record, or something far more sinister was taking place. When Finch brought these discrepancies to Sheriff Holt, the lawman's reaction was immediate and defensive. The Coopertons were a private but respectable family, Holt explained with poorly concealed irritation, who had suffered more than their fair share of tragedy. Their occasional failure to properly register births was understandable given their isolation. As for the uniformity of the death certificates, Dr. Crow had been the attending physician for most of the deaths, and his diagnosis was based on solid medical evidence. But Finch was not satisfied with explanations that seemed designed to discourage further inquiry. He had been sent to Jasper County with a clear mandate to establish accurate vital records, and the Cooperton files represented exactly the kind of statistical impossibility his assignment was designed to address. He formally requested permission to interview the family directly, examine their private records, and conduct a comprehensive review of all births and deaths at the compound. Sheriff Holt's refusal was polite but absolutely final. The Coopertons had cooperated fully with all legal requirements, he insisted, and there was no justification for subjecting a grieving family to additional scrutiny based on statistical speculation. Any attempt to harass law-abiding citizens without proper cause would be viewed as serious overreach. The Cooperton matter was officially closed. The young clerk might have accepted this dismissal if not for a conversation he overheard in the company store 3 days later. Two timber cruisers were discussing in hushed tones a strange smell that had been drifting from the direction of the Cooperton compound, a sweet, nauseating odor that reminded them of meat left too long in the summer sun. When they noticed Finch listening intently, they quickly changed the subject and moved away. That same evening, Finch encountered Dr. Crow at the hotel bar, and the older man's behavior struck him as suspicious and evasive. When Finch casually mentioned his statistical concerns about the Cooperton death certificates, Crow became visibly agitated, his hands trembling as he insisted that his medical diagnoses had been based on direct observation and professional expertise. But when Finch pressed him for specific details about the symptoms he had observed, the doctor became increasingly evasive, claiming that medical confidentiality prevented him from discussing individual cases. It was the evasiveness and obvious fear, even more than the impossible statistics, that convinced Finch he was dealing with a deliberate cover-up rather than simple incompetence. In his experience, honest mistakes produced random errors scattered throughout documentation, while systematic deception created unmistakable patterns. The mathematical uniformity of the Cooperton death certificates, combined with the consistent refusal of local authorities to permit closer examination, suggested a conspiracy that went far beyond simple record-keeping errors. Finch began conducting his own careful investigation, visiting the company store to review decades of purchase records and interviewing longtime residents about their memories of the Cooperton family. What he discovered was a pattern of behavior that seemed designed to avoid outside scrutiny and maintain absolute secrecy. The family purchased supplies in bulk quantities, always paying in cash, and their purchases included unusually large amounts of salt, spices, and preservation materials that seemed excessive for a family engaged in timber operations. More disturbing were the fragmentary stories he managed to piece together from trappers and timber cruisers who had worked in the pine barrens over the decades. Several mentioned strange sounds and unsettling smells that occasionally drifted from the direction of the Cooperton compound, always at night, always during the winter months when the family was supposedly completely isolated. One grizzled trapper claimed to have seen heavy smoke rising from the compound during a particularly severe January blizzard. The pattern that emerged from Finch's investigation was one of a family that had learned to operate completely outside normal social structures. They appeared in town only when absolutely necessary, conducted their business with mechanical efficiency and minimal conversation, and returned immediately to their compound without engaging in casual social interaction. Even their public displays of grief over their repeated losses seemed somehow performative and hollow. By late December of 1912, Finch had compiled enough circumstantial evidence to convince himself that the Cooperton family was engaged in systematic fraud at minimum, and quite possibly something far more sinister. The death certificates were clearly forgeries designed to conceal the true fate of children who had not died from any natural cause. The isolation of the compound was maintained not simply by geography, but by deliberate and carefully orchestrated secrecy that appeared to extend to active collusion with local authorities. The numbers didn't lie, but numbers alone could not overcome the wall of silence that had protected the Coopertons from outside interference for more than 2 decades. What Elias Finch did not yet realize was that his investigation had already attracted the attention of the very people he was investigating, and they were not prepared to allow an ambitious county clerk from the outside to destroy what they had so carefully built and maintained in the suffocating darkness of the Pine Barrens. The breakthrough that would finally crack open the Cooperton conspiracy came from the most unlikely source imaginable, an elderly woman whose arthritis had forced her into retirement and whose failing memory had begun to blur the careful distinctions between truth and the lies she had helped maintain for decades. Maud Gable had served as the unofficial midwife for Jasper County since 1887, attending births in remote cabins and isolated compounds where no doctor would venture, armed with nothing more than clean cloths, boiled water, and 5 decades of hard-won experience. At 73 years old, Maud lived alone in a small house behind the Methodist church, her days spent tending a garden that grew smaller each year, and her nights haunted by memories of the hundreds of babies she had delivered, the mothers she had saved, and the children she had been unable to help. She had been trying to avoid Elias Finch for weeks, crossing streets when she saw him coming and refusing to answer her door when he knocked. But the persistent young clerk had finally cornered her at the company store on a frigid January morning in 1913. Finch had approached her with the same polite professionalism he had shown to everyone else in Grist Mill Bend, explaining that he was conducting a routine review of birth and death records and hoped she might be able to clarify some discrepancies in the official documentation. But something about the way he pronounced the name Cooperton made Maud's hands begin to shake, and she found herself agreeing to meet with him privately at her home that afternoon, though she could not have explained why. What happened during that meeting would later be described by Finch as the most disturbing conversation of his entire career in public service. Sitting in Maud's cramped parlor with a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, the county clerk listened as the old woman began to unravel 26 years of carefully constructed lies, her voice barely above a whisper as she described a horror that had haunted her dreams for decades. The first time Maud had been called to the Cooperton compound was in the spring of 1890, when Ephraim's wife Martha had gone into labor with what would have been her 4th child. Maud had made the difficult journey through the Pine Barrens in her wagon, guided by one of the thin cousins who had appeared at her door in the middle of the night, speaking only to give her directions and then lapsing back into the unnerving silence that seemed to define the entire family. What she found at the compound was a birth that proceeded normally in every medical respect. The child, a healthy boy weighing nearly 8 pounds, was delivered without complications and showed all the signs of robust health that any midwife would hope to see. But something about the family's reaction to the birth had struck Maud as profoundly wrong, though it would take her years to understand exactly what she had witnessed. Before we continue down this dark path, I want to know what brings you here tonight, watching this story unfold. Tell me in the comments what drew you to this particular tale. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. Instead of the joy and relief that typically accompanied the successful delivery of a healthy child, the Coopertons had greeted the birth with a cold, clinical assessment that made Maud's skin crawl. Ephraim had examined the infant with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock, checking the child's weight and general health, while discussing with Martha whether this particular baby would serve their purposes or if they would need to wait for the next birth. At the time, Maud had assumed she was witnessing some strange ritual related to the family's supposed hereditary curse, a superstitious evaluation of the child's prospects for survival given their history of infant mortality. But when she returned 6 months later to check on the family, she was told that the healthy boy she had delivered had died of congenital anemia just weeks after birth, despite having shown no symptoms of blood disorders during his first months of life. This pattern repeated itself over and over during Maud's years of service to the Cooperton family. She would be summoned to deliver healthy, robust children who showed every sign of normal development, only to be informed months later that these same children had succumbed to the family curse. Meanwhile, the children who were genuinely sickly or born with obvious medical problems seemed to disappear from the family's accounting entirely, as if they had never existed at all. The breaking point came in 1908, when Maud was called to deliver twins to one of the younger Cooperton women. Both children were born healthy and strong, but during the delivery, Maud overheard a conversation between Ephraim and his eldest son that made her blood run cold. They were discussing which of the twins would be kept and which would be prepared for what they called the family table, speaking in the same matter-of-fact tone that farmers used when deciding which animals to slaughter and which to keep for breeding. The horrifying implication of what she had heard sent Maud into a state of shock that lasted for days. When she finally found the courage to question the family about the twins' welfare during a follow-up visit, she was told that both children had died of complications related to their premature birth, despite having been born at full term and in perfect health. But what haunted Maud most was not the lie itself, but the casual way Ephraim delivered it, as if he had grown so accustomed to deception that truth had become a foreign concept. From that point forward, Maud began keeping her own private records of the births she attended at the Cooperton compound, documenting not only the official information that would eventually make its way into county records, but also her personal observations about each child's health, development, and the family's reaction to each birth. What emerged from this secret documentation was a pattern so systematic and horrifying that Maud found herself unable to sleep at night. The Coopertons were not simply a family cursed by hereditary disease. They were operating what could only be described as a breeding program, carefully orchestrating pregnancies and births to produce a steady supply of healthy children who would then be consumed by the adult members of the family. The sickly children, the stillborn, and the genuinely diseased were disposed of in unmarked graves, while the healthy ones were processed through the windowless building that Samuel Morrison had observed during his nighttime encounter. When Maud finished her confession, Elias Finch sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process the implications of what he had just heard. The statistical anomalies that had first drawn his attention to the Cooperton family suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The uniform death certificates, the gaps in birth records, and the family's suspicious purchasing patterns all pointed to a single monstrous conclusion. But Maud was not finished. From a hiding place behind a loose brick in her kitchen fireplace, she retrieved a leather-bound ledger that contained 23 years of carefully recorded observations about every birth she had attended at the Cooperton compound. The entries were written in her careful, precise handwriting, documenting dates, weights, health assessments, and the family's reactions to each child in meticulous detail. As Finch examined the ledger by lamplight, he realized he was holding the key to exposing the most systematic and horrifying crime in the history of Jasper County. But he also understood that Maud's testimony and records would never be sufficient to bring the Coopertons to justice. The family had spent decades building relationships with local authorities, and their influence extended far beyond what an outsider like Finch could hope to overcome with documentation alone. What no one realized was that the conversation between Finch and Maud had been observed by one of the Thin cousins, who had been watching the midwife's house for weeks under orders from Ephraim. The family had long suspected that Maud might eventually become a problem, and they had been waiting for the right moment to ensure her permanent silence. The county clerk's investigation had simply provided them with the justification they needed to take decisive action. This was not just crime. This was a system that had fed on human lives for decades. And now the only two people who could expose it had painted targets on their backs that would make them the hunted rather than the hunters in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives. The next piece of the horrifying puzzle came from a man whose conscience had been slowly destroying him for over a decade. A physician who had compromised his oath so completely that he could no longer look at himself in the mirror without seeing the face of an accomplice to mass murder. Dr. Alistair Crowe had been drinking heavily since his encounter with Elias Finch at the hotel bar, and the county clerk's persistent questions had awakened a guilt that no amount of alcohol could numb. 3 days after Maud Gable's devastating confession, Crowe appeared at Finch's hotel room in the early hours of the morning, his hands shaking and his clothes reeking of whiskey and desperation. The doctor looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a week, his eyes hollow and his face gaunt with the weight of secrets. Without preamble, he pushed his way into the room and collapsed into a chair, his voice barely a whisper as he began to speak. The story that emerged was one of gradual corruption, a slow descent into complicity that had begun with what seemed like a simple request for medical discretion and had ended with Crowe becoming an active participant in covering up the most systematic series of murders in Jasper County's history. It had started in 1901 when Sheriff Holt had approached him with what he described as a delicate situation involving a respected local family. The Coopertons, Holt had explained, were suffering from a hereditary condition that caused frequent infant mortality, and they were understandably sensitive about the stigma associated with their genetic curse. They had requested that Dr. Crowe provide medical certification for their deceased children without requiring the usual examinations, both to spare the family additional trauma and to maintain their privacy in a community already suspicious of their unusual circumstances. At first, Crowe had resisted, explaining that proper medical documentation required direct examination and that he could not ethically sign death certificates based solely on second-hand reports. But Holt had been persistent, eventually revealing that the arrangement had full support from county authorities and that Crow's cooperation would be seen as valuable community service. More importantly, the sheriff had hinted that doctors unwilling to show flexibility might find their practices subject to increased scrutiny from county health inspectors. Over the following decade, Crow had signed more than 20 death certificates for Cooperton children, all listing congenital anemia as the cause of death, all based on nothing more than the family's word and Sheriff Holt's assurances that the arrangements were legitimate. The doctor had rationalized his participation by telling himself that he was helping a tragic family maintain their dignity, and the substantial payments he received had allowed him to expand his practice and improve his standing in the community. But doubts had begun to creep in as early as 1905, when Crow realized that the mortality rate he was documenting was statistically impossible. Even families with the most severe hereditary blood disorders rarely experience the kind of uniform, predictable infant mortality that the Coopertons seemed to suffer. Moreover, the descriptions of symptoms that the family provided were often inconsistent with the medical realities of anemia, suggesting either poor observation or deliberate deception. The breaking point had come in 1909, when Ephraim Cooperton had approached Crow directly with a request that chilled the doctor to the bone. One of the family's infants had died under circumstances that might attract unwanted attention from county authorities, and they needed a death certificate that would provide adequate legal cover for burial without formal investigation. But when Crow had asked for details about the child's symptoms, Ephraim had smiled coldly and suggested that the doctor's curiosity was both unnecessary and potentially dangerous. It was then that Crow had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of refusing to participate in what was clearly a fraudulent scheme, he had demanded to examine the deceased child before signing any documentation. Ephraim had agreed to this request, but the examination that followed had revealed evidence of trauma that was completely inconsistent with death from natural causes. The infant's body showed signs of what could only be described as systematic butchery. The child had been healthy and well-nourished at the time of death, but portions of muscle tissue had been carefully removed from the limbs and torso with surgical precision. Most disturbing of all, the examination revealed that these procedures had been performed while the child was still alive, suggesting a level of methodical cruelty that defied comprehension. Crow's horrified reaction had been met with calm pragmatism from Ephraim, who explained that the family's survival depended on practices that outsiders might not understand, but that were necessary for maintaining their bloodline in the face of the curse that had plagued them for generations. The infant's death had been a sacrifice for the greater good of the family, and Crow's role was simply to provide legal documentation that would prevent interference from ignorant authorities. The doctor's attempt to refuse further participation had been met with quiet but unmistakable threats from both Ephraim and Sheriff Holt. They had made it clear that his decade of complicity in fraudulent death certificates had made him an accessory to whatever crimes the family might be committing, and that any attempt to expose their activities would result in his own prosecution for conspiracy and fraud. Moreover, they had suggested that his continued good health and professional reputation depended on his willingness to maintain the profitable arrangements. From that point forward, Dr. Crow had continued to sign death certificates for Cooperton children while living in a state of constant terror and self-loathing. He had begun drinking heavily to numb the guilt and horror of what he had witnessed, and his medical practice had suffered as his hands began to shake and his judgment became increasingly unreliable. But he had continued to participate because the alternative, exposure and prosecution as an accomplice to mass murder seemed even worse than the moral corruption slowly destroying his soul. The most chilling detail of Crow's confession was his revelation that the Cooperton family had developed their cannibalistic practices into a sophisticated system of food preservation. The windowless building that Samuel Morrison had observed was actually a processing facility where the healthy children were butchered and prepared for consumption, while the basement of the main house had been converted into a cold storage area where meat could be preserved for months at a time. When Dr. Crow finished his confession, he sat in stunned silence before reaching into his coat and withdrawing a carbon copy of the 1909 death certificate that had first revealed the true nature of the Cooperton family's activities. The document bore his official signature and seal, but written in pencil along the margin were notes he had made during his examination of the infant's body, clinical observations that provided unmistakable evidence of systematic torture and butchery. As Elias Finch examined the document by lamplight, he realized that he now possessed testimony and physical evidence that could potentially bring the Cooperton family to justice. But he also understood that both he and Dr. Crow were now in mortal danger, having accumulated knowledge that the family could not allow to survive. With the doctor's testimony, Elias now had proof of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Jasper County's government. But he was beginning to understand that the corruption ran so deep that conventional justice might be impossible to achieve. The question was no longer whether the Coopertons were guilty of unspeakable crimes, but whether anyone with the power to stop them could be trusted to act on the evidence that was slowly bringing their monstrous system into the light. The confrontation that would finally bring the Cooperton conspiracy into the open came when Elias Finch made a fateful decision to telegraph his findings directly to the state capitol, bypassing Sheriff Holt entirely. On the morning of January 15, 1913, the county clerk sent a devastating summary to the state attorney general, describing the statistical impossibilities in the death records, Maud Gable's testimony about the breeding program, and Dr. Crow's confession regarding fraudulent certificates. The response came with startling swiftness. By the afternoon of January 16th, a delegation of state investigators had arrived in Grist Mill Bend, led by Deputy Attorney General Marcus Wade, a stern man who had built his reputation prosecuting corruption cases in rural counties where local law enforcement could not be trusted. Wade brought with him 2 state marshals, a forensic physician, and explicit authority to conduct whatever investigations he deemed necessary. Sheriff Holt's reaction to this unwelcome intrusion was immediate and telling. Rather than cooperating, he demanded to see the specific allegations, insisting that any irregularities in county records were simply clerical errors. When Wade informed him that the investigation would proceed regardless of local cooperation, Holt's demeanor shifted from defensive to openly hostile. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Wade's delegation attempted to examine the official county records. During the night of January 16th, someone had broken into the county clerk's office and removed several boxes of vital statistics documents, including all death certificates filed for the Cooperton family over the previous 2 decades. The burglary had been accomplished with surgical precision, leaving other records untouched. Wade's response to this obvious obstruction was to declare the Cooperton compound off-limits to all unauthorized personnel and to inform Sheriff Holt that he was now considered a person of interest in a potential conspiracy case. Any further interference would result in immediate arrest on federal charges. The confrontation that followed revealed the extent to which the Cooperton conspiracy had corrupted local government. Rather than submitting to state authority, Holt had assembled a group of armed men who claimed to be deputies but who were actually local residents with financial ties to various illegal activities that the sheriff had been protecting for years. The standoff outside the county courthouse forced townspeople to choose between supporting local authority or cooperating with outsiders who threatened to expose secrets that many had helped to keep. It was during this tense confrontation that Deputy Attorney General Wade made the decision to proceed immediately to the Cooperton compound, accompanied by his marshals and the forensic physician, leaving Sheriff Holt to face federal charges for obstruction of justice. The delegation departed Grist Mill Bend at dawn on January 17th, following the narrow road deep into the pine barrens, guided by Elias Finch, who had volunteered to show them the way despite the obvious danger. The confrontation that would finally bring the Cooperton conspiracy into the open came when Elias Finch made a fateful decision to telegraph his findings directly to the state capitol, bypassing Sheriff Holt entirely. On the morning of January 15th, 1913, the county clerk sent a devastating summary to the state attorney general, describing the statistical impossibilities in the death records, Maud Gable's testimony about the breeding program, and Dr. Crow's confession regarding fraudulent certificates. The response came with startling swiftness. By the afternoon of January 16th, a delegation of state investigators had arrived in Grist Mill Bend, led by Deputy Attorney General Marcus Wade, a stern man who had built his reputation prosecuting corruption cases in rural counties where local law enforcement could not be trusted. Wade brought with him 2 state marshals, a forensic physician, and explicit authority to conduct whatever investigations he deemed necessary. Sheriff Holt's reaction to this unwelcome intrusion was immediate and telling. Rather than cooperating, he demanded to see the specific allegations, insisting that any irregularities in county records were simply clerical errors. When Wade informed him that the investigation would proceed regardless of local cooperation, Holt's demeanor shifted from defensive to openly hostile. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when Wade's delegation attempted to examine the official county records. During the night of January 16th, someone had broken into the county clerk's office and removed several boxes of vital statistics documents, including all death certificates filed for the Cooperton family over the previous 2 decades. The burglary had been accomplished with surgical precision, leaving other records untouched. Wade's response to this obvious obstruction was to declare the Cooperton compound off-limits to all unauthorized personnel and to inform Sheriff Holt that he was now considered a person of interest in a potential conspiracy case. Any further interference would result in immediate arrest on federal charges. The confrontation that followed revealed the extent to which the Cooperton conspiracy had corrupted local government. Rather than submitting to state authority, Holt had assembled a group of armed men who claimed to be deputies but who were actually local residents with financial ties to various illegal activities that the sheriff had been protecting for years. The standoff outside the county courthouse forced townspeople to choose between supporting local authority or cooperating with outsiders who threatened to expose secrets that many had helped to keep. It was during this tense confrontation that Deputy Attorney General Wade made the decision to proceed immediately to the Cooperton compound, accompanied by his marshals and the forensic physician, leaving Sheriff Holt to face federal charges for obstruction of justice. The delegation departed Grist Mill Bend at dawn on January 17th, following the narrow road deep into the pine barrens, guided by Elias Finch, who had volunteered to show them the way, despite the obvious danger. What they found when they reached the compound was a scene of apparent normalcy that struck Wade as profoundly unsettling. The main house and outbuildings showed no signs of hasty departure or destruction of evidence, and the few family members who were visible went about their daily activities with the same mechanical efficiency that had always characterized their behavior. Ephraim Cooperton greeted the delegation with polite curiosity, explaining that his family had heard rumors of trouble in town but had remained on their property to avoid involvement. Wade's request to search the buildings was met with calm compliance from Ephraim, who explained that his family had nothing to hide and welcomed the opportunity to clear up any misunderstandings. The patriarch's cooperative attitude was so convincing that Wade began to wonder if the entire investigation might be based on nothing more than the delusions of an obsessed county clerk. The first search of the main house revealed a spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean living space, with no obvious evidence of the horrific activities that Finch's witnesses had described. The family members who were present appeared malnourished and withdrawn, but showed no signs of fear or guilt. Even the basement that Dr. Crow had described as a cold storage facility contained nothing more suspicious than preserved vegetables and smoked meats that appeared to be of animal origin. It was only when the forensic physician began examining the windowless building that Morrison had observed that the true nature of the operation began to emerge. The structure, which Ephraim dismissed as a simple smokehouse, contained equipment and residues that told a very different story. The floors showed evidence of repeated scrubbing with lye, but traces of human blood were still detectable in the wooden planks. More disturbing was the discovery of butchering tools that showed modifications suggesting they had been adapted for use on human rather than animal carcasses. The instruments had been maintained with professional care and showed signs of frequent use, despite Ephraim's claim that the family rarely engaged in hunting. The breakthrough came when one of the state marshals discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floor of the smokehouse, containing items that provided unmistakable evidence of the family's true activities. The cache included detailed records of births and deaths that contradicted official county documentation, personal effects that had obviously belonged to children, and most damning of all, a series of photographs that documented various stages of the processing operation in graphic detail. As Wade examined these horrifying materials by lamplight, he realized that the Cooperton family had developed their practices into a systematic operation that treated human children as livestock to be bred, slaughtered, and consumed with industrial efficiency. The photographic evidence alone was sufficient to support murder charges against every adult member of the family. The most chilling discovery came when the forensic physician examined the burial ground behind the smokehouse. Excavation of several graves revealed the remains of children who had clearly been butchered before burial, with evidence suggesting that usable meat had been removed before disposal. But equally disturbing was the realization that the number of graves far exceeded the number of deaths that had been officially recorded. They had been warned, and Elias knew the Coopertons would now dispose of any evidence, but he didn't know that the family's next victim was already chosen. As Wade's delegation prepared to make arrests and secure the compound as a crime scene, they were unaware that Ephraim had already set in motion a plan that would ensure the family's secrets died with them rather than face exposure in a public trial. While Deputy Attorney General Wade and his team had been methodically uncovering the physical evidence of the Cooperton family's horrific crimes, Elias Finch had returned to his hotel room in Grist Mill Bend to conduct what would prove to be the most chilling mathematical analysis of his career. Armed with Maud Gable's secret ledger, Dr. Crow's testimony, and his own meticulous records of the statistical anomalies that had first drawn his attention to the case, the county clerk set about reconstructing the true scope of the family's cannibalistic operations over the previous 25 years. The calculation that emerged from Finch's painstaking work was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Cross-referencing Maud's birth records with the official death certificates, the company store's purchasing records, and the fragmentary testimony of witnesses, who had observed activities at the compound over the years. Finch was able to construct a mathematical model that revealed the industrial scale of the Coopertons' systematic murder and consumption of their own children. According to Maud's carefully maintained ledger, the family had produced 47 live births between 1890 and 1913, not counting stillbirths or children who had died within hours of delivery. Of these 47 children, only 12 had been officially recorded as deaths in the county vital statistics, all attributed to congenital anemia. This left 35 children whose fate had never been officially documented. A statistical impossibility that could only be explained by systematic fraud on the part of local authorities. But the most damning evidence came from Finch's analysis of the family's purchasing patterns at the company store over the same 25-year period. During times when the family claimed to have 12 or more members living at the compound, they had consistently purchased food supplies sufficient to feed no more than 8 adults. This discrepancy could only be explained if a significant portion of the family's nutritional needs were being met through sources that did not appear in any legitimate commercial records. The horrifying conclusion that emerged from these calculations was inescapable. The Coopertons had been systematically breeding children for the specific purpose of consuming them, maintaining a carefully controlled population that balanced their need for reproductive stock against their requirements for food. The healthy children were processed through the smokehouse that Morrison had observed, while the sickly or deformed were disposed of in the unmarked graves that the forensic physician was now excavating. The mathematical precision of the operation was what struck Finch as most disturbing. The family had not simply been engaging in cannibalism as a desperate survival strategy, but had developed their practices into a science that treated human reproduction as a form of agriculture. They had calculated the optimal ratio of breeding adults to consumable children, determined the most efficient processing methods, and established preservation techniques that allowed them to maintain a steady food supply throughout the year. Even more chilling was Finch's realization that the family's operations had been expanding over time. The number of births recorded in Maud's ledger showed a steady increase from year to year, suggesting that the Coopertons had been deliberately growing their breeding program to meet the nutritional demands of an adult population that was also increasing through intermarriage and the maturation of children who had been selected for breeding rather than consumption. The financial records that Finch had compiled told the same story from an economic perspective. The family's purchases of salt, spices, and preservation materials had increased dramatically over the previous decade, indicating that they were processing larger quantities of meat and storing it for longer periods. Their investment in specialized equipment and the expansion of their processing facilities suggested a level of long-term planning that contradicted any notion that their cannibalistic practices were the result of poverty or desperation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Finch's mathematical analysis was what it revealed about the selection criteria that the family used to determine which children would be kept for breeding and which would be consumed. Based on the ages and physical descriptions recorded in Maud's ledger, compared against the official death certificates and the family's own internal records that had been discovered in the hidden cache, Finch was able to reconstruct the systematic methodology that guided the Coopertons' choices. Children who showed signs of the family's hereditary pallor and thinness were consistently selected for breeding, while those who appeared healthier and more robust were marked for consumption. This inverted logic suggested that the family had developed a breeding program specifically designed to maintain the physical characteristics that made them appear sickly and malnourished to outside observers, using this deception as camouflage for their true activities. The final element of Finch's analysis was his calculation of the total number of victims that the Cooperton family had claimed over the course of their 25-year operation. Based on the evidence he had compiled, conservative estimates suggested that at least 30 children had been systematically murdered and consumed, with the actual number likely being significantly higher when accounting for children whose births had never been officially recorded and whose deaths had left no trace in any documentation. As Finch completed his mathematical reconstruction of the family's crimes, he realized that he was looking at evidence of what might be the most extensive and systematic series of murders in American history. The Coopertons had not simply been isolated cannibals, but had developed their practices into an industrial operation that had claimed dozens of lives over the course of more than 2 decades, all while maintaining the facade of a tragic family cursed by hereditary disease. The math was incontrovertible, the evidence was overwhelming, and the scope of the horror was beyond anything that Finch had imagined when he had first noticed the statistical anomalies in the county death records. But as he sat in his hotel room, surrounded by ledgers and calculations that documented the systematic murder of children, Elias Finch understood that the mathematical proof of the Coopertons' guilt might never see the inside of a courtroom. The math was always the last thing to lie, and the numbers told a story of horror that no amount of official denial or local corruption could explain away. The Coopertons were not just a family with a secret, they were the operators of a human slaughterhouse that had been hiding in plain sight for a quarter century, protected by a conspiracy of silence that extended throughout the entire community of Grist Mill Bend. The climactic confrontation that would end the Cooperton family's reign of horror began not with the dramatic arrests that Deputy Attorney General Wade had planned, but with the desperate cry of an infant whose birth had sealed his own death warrant. On the evening of January 17, 1913, as Wade's team was preparing to return to Grist Mill Bend with their damning evidence, the sound of a newborn's wail echoed through the pine barrens from the direction of the Cooperton compound. Maud Gable had been summoned to the compound earlier that afternoon by one of the thin cousins, who had appeared at her door with the same silent urgency that had characterized such visits for more than 2 decades. Despite her recent confession to Elias Finch and her growing terror about the family's reaction to the state investigation, the elderly midwife had felt compelled to answer what might be her final call to deliver a child into a world where that child's survival depended on characteristics that no mother should have to pray for. The infant who emerged into the flickering lamplight of the main house was everything that would doom him in the twisted logic of the Cooperton family's selection process. Abel, as he would later be named, was robust and healthy, weighing nearly 9 pounds and showing none of the pallor or frailty that might have marked him for breeding rather than consumption. His lusty cries and vigorous movements announced to everyone present that this child would serve the family's needs in the most horrific way possible. What Maud witnessed in the hours following Abel's birth was a scene that crystallized all of her worst fears about the family's true nature. Rather than celebrating the arrival of a healthy child, the Coopertons had treated the birth as the beginning of a processing operation, with Ephraim conducting the same cold assessment that had chilled Morrison during his nighttime encounter years earlier. The infant's weight was recorded, his general health was evaluated, and preparations were begun for what the family euphemistically referred to as the cleansing ritual. It was during these preparations that the presence of the state investigators became a critical factor in the unfolding tragedy. Ephraim had received word from his informants in town that Wade's delegation had discovered the hidden cache in the smokehouse and was preparing to return with arrest warrants for every adult member of the family. Faced with the certainty of exposure and prosecution, the patriarch had made a decision that would transform what should have been a methodical murder into a desperate gamble for survival. Rather than proceeding with the careful, systematic processing that had characterized the family's operations for decades, Ephraim had ordered that the cleansing ritual be accelerated and that preparations be made for the complete destruction of the compound and everyone in it. The family's secrets would die with them, rather than face the humiliation of a public trial that would expose their practices to a world that could never understand the necessity of what they had done to survive. The confrontation that followed pitted Maud Gable, an elderly midwife armed with nothing more than moral outrage and maternal instinct, against a family that had spent 25 years perfecting the art of systematic murder. When the old woman realized what was being planned for the infant she had just delivered, she experienced a moment of moral clarity that overcame decades of complicity and fear. In a desperate attempt to save Abel's life, Maud had grabbed the infant from the makeshift altar where he had been placed and fled from the main house into the darkness of the pine barrens. Her flight had triggered an immediate response from the Cooperton adults, who pursued her through the swampy terrain with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all of their activities. But in their haste to prevent the escape of their intended victim, the family had made a fatal error that would destroy everything they had built. In the chaos of the pursuit, someone had knocked over one of the oil lamps that illuminated the main house, sending burning fuel across the wooden floors and igniting the tinder-dry walls that had been seasoned by decades of smoke from the processing operations. The fire that resulted spread with terrifying speed through the interconnected buildings of the compound, trapping several family members and destroying the carefully maintained infrastructure of their cannibalistic enterprise. It was the smoke and flames rising from the direction of the compound that alerted Deputy Attorney General Wade and his team to the crisis that was unfolding just miles from their location. Racing through the pine barrens with Elias Finch as their guide, the state investigators arrived at the compound to find a scene of almost biblical destruction, with the main house and several outbuildings fully engulfed in flames that lit up the night sky like a funeral pyre. But the most remarkable discovery came when Wade's team encountered Maud Gable, emerging from the swamps with the infant Abel clutched against her chest and her clothes torn and muddied from her flight through the treacherous terrain. The old woman's decision to risk her own life to save a child who was destined for slaughter had not only preserved the one piece of evidence that could never be destroyed or denied, but had also triggered the chain of events that would bring the Cooperton conspiracy to its fiery conclusion. As the compound burned around them, Wade's marshals were able to apprehend 3 of the adult Coopertons who had survived the fire, including Ephraim himself, who had been attempting to destroy the last of the family's records when the flames had trapped him in the smokehouse. But the cost of this final confrontation was measured not just in the destruction of buildings and evidence, but in the realization that several family members, including some of the thin cousins who had never been seen clearly by outside observers, had perished in the flames. The infant Abel, whose robust health had sealed his death warrant in the twisted logic of his family's breeding program, had become the sole survivor of a bloodline that had sustained itself through systematic cannibalism for more than 2 decades. His rescue by Maud Gable represented not just the salvation of a single life, but the preservation of living proof that the Cooperton family's claims of hereditary weakness and infant mortality had been nothing more than an elaborate cover story for mass murder. As the compound burned to the ground, it seemed the truth would be consumed with it, but one piece of evidence had escaped the flames. The infant who cried in Maud Gable's arms was testimony to the fact that the Coopertons had not been victims of a genetic curse, but perpetrators of a crime so systematic and so monstrous that it challenged everything that the people of Gristmill Bend thought they knew about the nature of human evil. The fire that destroyed the Cooperton compound would burn for 3 days, consuming not just buildings and evidence, but the carefully constructed mythology that had protected one of the most horrific family enterprises in American history. But the child who survived that fire would carry within him the genetic proof that his family's supposed curse had been nothing more than camouflage for an appetite that had consumed dozens of children over the course of a quarter-century. The true scope of the conspiracy that had protected the Cooperton family for 25 years only became apparent in the days following the fire, when Deputy Attorney General Wade attempted to prosecute the surviving family members and discovered that the corruption extended far deeper into the fabric of Jasper County government than anyone had imagined. What had initially appeared to be a case of systematic murder committed by an isolated family revealed itself to be an elaborate cover-up that implicated dozens of local officials, business leaders, and prominent citizens in a conspiracy of silence that had enabled mass murder on an industrial scale. The first indication that Wade was dealing with something far more complex than a simple criminal case came when he attempted to arrange temporary custody for the infant Abel, who had become the state's most important piece of evidence in the prosecution of the surviving Coopertons. Rather than the routine legal process that such arrangements typically required, Wade encountered a series of bureaucratic obstacles that seemed designed to prevent the child from being placed with reliable caregivers outside of Jasper County. Judge Harrison Blackwood, who presided over the county court, had initially refused to grant Wade's request for emergency custody, claiming that the infant should remain in the care of local authorities until proper hearings could be arranged. When Wade pointed out that local authorities were themselves under investigation for their role in the conspiracy, Blackwood had reluctantly agreed to allow the child to be placed with a family in the state capital, but only after extracting a promise that the arrangement would be kept strictly confidential. More troubling was the reaction of Gristmill Bend's business community to news of the arrests and the destruction of the Cooperton compound. Rather than expressing relief that a family of murderers had been stopped, local merchants and timber company officials had approached Wade with concerns about the economic impact that a sensational trial might have on the region's reputation. They suggested that the interests of the community would be better served by a quiet resolution that avoided the kind of publicity that might discourage outside investment in the county's lumber industry. The pressure to minimize the scope of the prosecutions intensified when Wade discovered that several prominent families in the county had financial connections to the Coopertons that dated back decades. The Jasper County Lumber Company, which employed most of the region's workforce, had been purchasing timber from the Cooperton mill at prices that were significantly above market rates, effectively subsidizing the family's operations through what appeared to be legitimate business transactions. But it was Sheriff Josiah Holt's desperate attempt to negotiate a plea agreement that revealed the true extent of the institutional complicity that had enabled the Coopertons' crimes. Faced with federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy, Holt had offered to provide testimony about what he described as a community-wide understanding that certain families were to be left alone by law enforcement, regardless of rumors or suspicions about their activities. According to Holt's confession, the arrangement that had protected the Coopertons was part of a broader system of selective law enforcement that had been in place since the county's establishment. Families with sufficient economic influence or political connections were effectively immune from serious investigation, while law enforcement resources were focused on controlling transient workers, preventing labor organizing, and maintaining the social order that kept the timber industry profitable. The Coopertons had not simply been ignored by local authorities. but had been actively protected by a network of officials who viewed their eccentric behavior and supposed hereditary illness as useful cover for activities that everyone preferred not to examine too closely. As long as the family kept to themselves and avoided drawing outside attention to the county, their business was considered their own, regardless of what that business might actually involve. Dr. Alistair Crow's expanded testimony provided even more damning evidence of the systematic nature of the cover-up. Under pressure from Wade's investigators, the doctor revealed that he had been approached by other prominent families over the years with requests for similar accommodations regarding death certificates and medical records. While none of these other cases had involved cannibalism, they had included instances of domestic violence, suspicious deaths, and other crimes that had been concealed through falsified medical documentation. The most chilling revelation came when Wade's team discovered that the infant Abel was not the first child to be rescued from the Cooperton compound. Maud Gable's expanded testimony revealed that she had delivered at least 3 other healthy children over the years who had subsequently been reported as stillborn or as dying shortly after birth, when in fact they had been quietly placed with families outside the county to prevent them from being consumed by their biological relatives. These earlier rescues had been conducted with the full knowledge and cooperation of local authorities who had viewed the removal of children from the compound as a humanitarian gesture that also served to limit the evidence of the family's cannibalistic practices. The children had been given new identities and placed with families who were told they were adopting orphans whose parents had died of hereditary diseases, ensuring that the truth about their origins would never emerge. Wade's investigation revealed that Judge Blackwood had personally overseen these illegal adoptions, working with Sheriff Holt and other officials to create false documentation that would allow the rescued children to disappear into new lives, while maintaining the official fiction that the Cooperton family suffered from unusually high rates of infant mortality. The conspiracy had not simply enabled the family's crimes, but had actively participated in covering up evidence that could have exposed their activities decades earlier. The realization that prominent citizens throughout Jasper County had known about the Coopertons' cannibalistic practices and had chosen to protect the family rather than their victims fundamentally changed the nature of Wade's investigation. What had begun as a prosecution of isolated murderers had evolved into an examination of systematic corruption that reached into every level of county government and business leadership. But the most disturbing aspect of the broader conspiracy was the discovery that similar arrangements might exist in other rural counties throughout the region, where powerful families with eccentric reputations were protected from scrutiny by local authorities who prioritized economic stability over law enforcement. Wade's investigation had uncovered not just a single family of cannibals, but a system of governance that enabled the wealthy and well-connected to commit crimes with impunity. As Wade prepared his case against the surviving Coopertons, he found himself facing a choice between pursuing a narrow prosecution that would bring the specific perpetrators to justice or exposing a broader pattern of corruption that might implicate dozens of additional defendants but would also reveal the extent to which rural law enforcement had been compromised by economic and political considerations. The monster wasn't just one family in the woods. It was the willing silence of an entire community that chose a lie over a truth too terrible to bear. The conspiracy that had protected the Coopertons was itself a form of cannibalism, consuming the principles of justice and human decency in order to preserve an economic and social order that valued stability above the lives of children. The real question was not whether the Coopertons were guilty of unspeakable crimes, but whether the system that had enabled those crimes could ever be reformed, or whether it would simply find new ways to protect the powerful at the expense of the innocent. In the end, the official record tells us that 3 members of the Cooperton family were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death, while Sheriff Josiah Holt and Judge Harrison Blackwood received lengthy prison terms for their roles in the conspiracy. The infant Abel was placed in protective custody and given a new identity, disappearing into a life far from the Pine Barrens, where his family had turned human reproduction into a form of agriculture designed to feed an appetite that defied comprehension. But the official record, like so many official records, tells only the story that those in power were willing to acknowledge. The broader implications of the Cooperton case were quietly buried beneath a narrative that emphasized the isolated nature of the crimes and the swift justice that had been delivered to their perpetrators. Dr. Alistair Crowe died by self-inflicted harm 3 months after the trial, leaving behind a letter that described his guilt over decades of complicity as unbearable. Maud Gable lived for 2 more years, but her mind deteriorated rapidly after the trauma, and she spent her remaining time speaking of children who cried in the darkness and fires that would not stop burning. Elias Finch, the county clerk whose mathematical curiosity had ultimately exposed the conspiracy, found his career destroyed by his involvement in the case. Despite his crucial role in bringing the Coopertons to justice, he was quietly transferred to a minor clerical position and warned that any attempt to discuss his investigation would result in immediate dismissal. He died in obscurity, his contribution to one of the most important criminal investigations in American history forgotten by everyone except a handful of officials who preferred it that way. The Cooperton compound was never rebuilt. The land was eventually purchased by the Jasper County Lumber Company and incorporated into their timber operations. Too many people knew what had happened there, and the presence of any permanent structure would serve as an unwelcome reminder of truths that the community had chosen to forget. The children who had been secretly rescued from the compound over the years were never informed of their true origins. They lived their lives believing they were orphans whose parents had died of hereditary diseases, unaware that they had been saved from a fate that would have turned them into food for their own relatives. Only Abel, the final survivor, carried within his genetic makeup the proof that the Cooperton family's supposed curse had been nothing more than an elaborate fiction. What we do know is that the Coopertons were not monsters in the sense that we typically understand the term. They were human beings who had developed a systematic approach to cannibalism that treated their own children as livestock, and they were protected in these activities by a community that valued economic stability above human life. They were the product of a system that allowed wealth and influence to purchase immunity from moral and legal accountability. The real horror of the Cooperton story is not that such crimes were committed, but that they were enabled by ordinary people who chose to look away rather than confront truths that threatened their comfortable assumptions. The conspiracy that protected the Coopertons was built not by criminals or psychopaths, but by sheriff's deputies and judges and business leaders who convinced themselves that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge. If you've made it this far into this dark journey with me, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on what we've learned together. Subscribe if you found this exploration of human darkness as disturbing and fascinating as I intended it to be, because the most chilling stories are often the ones that force us to confront the uncomfortable realities about power, complicity, and the prices that societies pay to maintain their illusions of innocence. The Coopertons are gone, their compound has been reclaimed by the Pine Barrens, and the official records of their crimes have been sealed away in archives that few people will ever examine. But the questions they raised about the relationship between economic power and criminal justice remain as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. The appetite that consumed the Cooperton children was not unique to one family in one isolated corner of the rural South. It was the appetite of a system that has always been willing to sacrifice the vulnerable to protect the interests of the powerful. In the deep woods of the pine barrens, where the bog water runs red with iron and the Spanish moss hangs like the hair of the drowned, some hungers never die. They simply learn new ways to feed.